What do Israel's fifth general elections in less than 4 years say about the stability of its political system? Is Israel's lurch to the extreme right unstoppable? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute's interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode of Connections, we're delighted to be speaking with Mairav Zonszein. Mairav Zonszein is Senior Analyst on Israel-Palestine with International Crisis Group, where she is responsible for covering Israeli domestic politics, relations with the Palestinians, and regional conflict settings and policies. Zonszein is an Israeli-American journalist and commentator who has covered Israeli politics and U.S. foreign policy for over a decade. Her work has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New York Review of Books, Foreign Policy, The Guardian, and The Nation. She is a founding editor of Plus 972 magazine and a contributor to Jewish Currents. Mairav Zonszein, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thank you very much for having me.
To start off, Israel, as I mentioned, has just conducted its fifth election in less than 4 years. Are these serial elections a sign of growing instability in the Israeli political arena? And related to that, what brought this particular election about?
Yeah, so Israel has been in political deadlock since 2019. There's two main reasons for that. I mean, the parliamentary system in Israel, which requires 120 Knesset seats, you need a majority of 61 to form a coalition. If you have that, it's very slim. And what we've had in recent election cycles is Prime Minister Netanyahu, up until recently, who's the longest serving prime minister, was unable to form those majority coalitions, or he had very slim majorities, and the government kept on falling, or he caused them to fall apart for his own interests. Now, Netanyahu has been on trial for several corruption charges since 2019. I think he was first indicted in 2017. And that very quickly changed the political landscape, because some people on the right in his party and other parties on the right began to defect and decide that they weren't going to work with him. That is what kind of started to shift the political map in Israel. What brought about this election now, the fifth in this cycle, is the government that we had from June 2021 until now was a hodgepodge government that managed to eke out enough of a coalition of 8 different parties. Naftali Bennett headed it at the beginning, and then Yair Lapid, who's more of a centrist, headed it up until now. And that government actually fell apart because Naftali Bennett's right-wing party member decided to leave. And that's really the issue with—
leave and defected to the Likud, or?
Correct. She defected to the Likud. He basically couldn't keep his party together. They all felt that he went too much to the left, which is objectively not really the case, but basically, you have a situation in which the two major parties in Israel, Labor and Likud, have gotten smaller, and other parties have grown a little bit bigger, and new parties have sprung up. And you have a situation in which one small party can hold the entire coalition hostage and then decide to drop or disintegrate the parliament based on a specific vote or a specific issue. So this is something that we've seen over and over again throughout Israeli history, and then even more acutely in the last few elections.
And is this something you would characterize as growing instability of the system?
I would say it's a reflection of an already very well-grown instability. It's something that, certain people who are experts on parliamentary elections and how parliaments work have already commented that there needs to be some kind of reform. I'm not sure exactly how that would come about, but it's clear that the multi-party system as it functions today is not working well for Israeli politics. Now, the idea of a parliamentary system, as I'm sure many of your audience members know, is to keep the balance so that you can't have, the tyranny of one party. But in reality, what's happened in Israel is that, as I said, little parties are able to carry a lot of leverage. So I think part of the solution to that is that parties need to merge and create bigger blocs, sort of more similar to the American system. In Israel, that's very difficult because each party has its own agenda that's very, very specific to its, ethnic identity, politics of that specific group.
And if we look at the outgoing government, you described it as a hodgepodge, and according to many, it was really only held together, and its only common policy platform was opposition to Netanyahu returning to office. Yet this is precisely what appears to have happened with these latest elections, which brings me to my next question, that news coverage of these elections has primarily focused on the anticipated return of Netanyahu to the prime minister's office and the further mainstreaming of the extreme right political parties. Are these also your main takeaways from the election results?
I would actually argue that the media coverage was much less about Netanyahu this time. It's almost like he's not even on trial for corruption. People seem to have forgotten about that. Just a couple of years ago, there were thousands, tens of thousands of people out on the streets in front of the residence, the prime minister's residence. They were protesting Netanyahu and his corruption. That didn't happen this time around, or it happened very, very little on some intersections throughout Israel. But the media coverage mostly this time focused on the rise of the far right list, which comprises a couple of parties, or really three parties, but two main ones, and Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Knesset member who just entered the Knesset in the last election, thanks to Netanyahu's legitimizing him, really was the star of this campaign, this election campaign, and the media coverage. And there's been plenty of reports about how the media kind of normalized and gave him much more airtime, similar to how Trump got so much more airtime than anyone else.
Can you tell us a bit about him?
Yes. So, Itamar Ben-Gvir is somebody who is notorious for, in the 90s, threatening the assassinated Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. He was amongst the group of the far right settlers at the time that were part of the incitement against Rabin when he went to Oslo. So he's kind of notorious in Israel for having taken an emblem off of Rabin's car and saying, we got to his car, we can get to him too. He said that 3 weeks before Rabin was assassinated. He's somebody who's been convicted of incitement to racism, of supporting terror, because he's affiliated with the Kach party, which was founded by Meir Kahane, an American-Israeli far-right Jewish nationalist. And even though that party was outlawed, it was disqualified from running in the Knesset in the 80s, and then it was outlawed in the 90s. He is a follower of this kind of ideology. So Itamar Ben-Gvir has continued and reincarnated that political ideology. He's a resident of the settlement of Kiryat Arba. I personally—
It's one of the most radical settlements located in the heart of Hebron, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's not actually in Hebron, it's just outside of Hebron, but yes, it's notorious. He runs around with people, and he himself is a person who is a provocator. He goes to places of friction and incites and causes violence against Palestinians. I've personally run into him when I've been in the southern West Bank several times, and I've seen how he is. He's basically looking to start tensions and incite the situation.
And he's now anticipated to become a senior figure if Netanyahu succeeds in forming the next government.
Yeah, he and his party, along with the other religious Zionist party that formed this list, have received 14 seats. They are the third largest list in the Knesset now, after Likud and Yesh Atid's Yair Lapid's Labor.
Lapid's Yesh Atid party.
Yes. So the point is that they're the third largest, which means that they have many seats and they command quite a lot of power in the Knesset, and I'm sure that they will negotiate to have quite senior roles. I don't know if you want to get into this now, but I do want to caveat and say that despite the fact that they have gained many, many seats in the Knesset, it has yet to be seen how Netanyahu, who is a very, very well-oiled politician, is going to handle it, because I think he, up until now, was very, if you look at the history of how he's formed coalitions, he's always formed coalitions with moderates to his left, whether it was Ehud Barak or Tzipi Livni or even Benny Gantz. He's always kind of preferred to grow his coalition and keep some people on the other side of the spectrum so that he can claim to be the kind of arbiter. So in this case, he doesn't really have that, and it has yet to be seen what will happen. So I just want to kind of caveat that despite this doomsday scenario, I have a feeling that Netanyahu will try to appear more statesmanlike on some of these issues.
And also because it would be in his interest to have as broad a coalition as possible, I presume.
That's right.
But continuing on the subject of the far right, what in your view is the significance of its growing representation in the Israeli parliament? And how is the entry of someone like Ben-Gvir different from previous participation by radical figures such as Avigdor Lieberman, Naftali Bennett, and others in Israel's governments? Do you expect this to produce any policy shifts?
Yeah, I mean, I'll get to the policy shifts in a minute. I'm not as sure about how that's going to look, but I'm glad that you brought up Lieberman and Bennett because, Israel has kind of, or people who have become accustomed here to a normalization of something, of ideas that are quite radical. I mean, Ben-Gvir has talked about, for example, deporting Palestinian citizens of Israel who he finds to be disloyal, whatever that means. And Avigdor Lieberman, almost 20 years ago in his campaign spoke about the fact that he wants to transfer Palestinian citizens out of Israel into let's say a future Palestinian state and do swaps with the populations. He has, talked about them as being disloyal, that they can't be trusted. He's incited against them. So this isn't really new. And when it comes to, settlements, or we had a settler prime minister just a few months ago. So the fact that Bennett, yeah. So the fact that Itamar and Lieberman is a settler, there's a lot of settlers have entered the mainstream of Israeli politics long ago. They've also entered other parts of government, so that's not really new either. I think the main thing that's new about Itamar Ben-Gvir is that his style is very much, he's out in the streets, and he's not refined. He's not interested in appearing to be, some kind of refined politician, but also that he screams it out from the rooftops very, very clearly. He talks about these issues, the same issues that, for example, if you look at the things that he talks about, whether it's inciting against Palestinian citizens of Israel or saying that there need to be looser open fire regulations in the West Bank, these things already happen. They happen whether, because of de facto, that's how the situation has gone, or because under Netanyahu specifically, Israeli policy has moved in that direction very clearly. For example, when Itamar Ben-Gvir talks about the need to strip Palestinians of any rights or autonomy in the future, or to dismantle the Palestinian Authority, I mean, Netanyahu has already done a lot to deteriorate the Palestinian Authority. So when you really break down the issues and the way that the situation is on the ground and the policies, they're not that different. The difference is that Itamar Ben-Gvir and the rest of his crew in this list are openly talking about it in a very incendiary way, because this is a sector of the Israeli society that is now proud to talk like that and is happy. If that's something that in the 80s was considered by the secular right to be unacceptable, embarrassing, not fit for a liberal democracy in the Middle East, today that's, which is part of the global far right's, attitude. It's like, we're proud, we're going to be ethnic and national, and we're going to be proud of it. And anybody who stands in our way, it's their problem. I mean, that's
and that brings me also to a related point, which is we've been discussing the parties and politicians, but there's also the electorate. Do you see this as part of a growing trend of a rightward shift of the Israeli Jewish electorate, or are we looking at an anomaly here in terms of this past election?
Well, it's a nuanced issue, because I mean, Israel as a country, as a public, is right wing. It's become more and more right wing. on different levels, whether you ask them about the two-state solution or other issues, depending on how you define what it means to be right-wing today. But Israelis are largely, the majority are, I would say, right, and what is considered center, I would also say, is somewhat right. And if you look at the makeup of the Knesset, it's also fairly to the right. So Israelis are relatively right-wing. At the same time, if you look, for example, at the raw numbers of the votes in this last election, they were pretty much even between the Netanyahu bloc and the anti-Netanyahu bloc. Now, the anti-Netanyahu bloc has members that are right-wing in it, so that explains why that is. But, you know, it's not like we've seen a dramatic rightward shift all of a sudden. It's a combination of different factors that include the fact that more people came out to vote this time around, especially young people, either from the settlements or right-wing religious young Jews who identify with the right, came out in bigger numbers. Also, the ultra-Orthodox parties that we haven't really spoken about, they were very upset with the last coalition because it was full of secular members who were trying to, for example, get public transportation on the Sabbath and issues that for them is a red line. So they really recruited a lot of their voters to come out, and they got several more seats as a result. So I would say that Israel has been steadily moving to the right for decades. And you could argue that Israel was, in some of its policies, always right-wing. But what we saw in this specific election is the sudden popularity of this specific religious Zionist bloc and a higher voter turnout in general coming out for the right. At the same time, you have the center left, what's left of the left. I'm talking about the Zionist left. They almost were completely decimated, and that's because they have a message that no longer speaks to many Israelis, and because many of their Israeli voters have left Israel. They no longer live here. They don't care to vote anymore. You know, this type of thing. So that kind of explains the.
And just to go a bit further on this issue of what it means to be a rightist in Israel, I think many foreigners, when they look at the Israeli political spectrum, they tend to assess it in relation to how Israelis see the occupation or the Palestinians and so on. But if we look at it in a domestic Israeli context, what are the main issues, apart from the Palestinians, that separate right from centrist and left-wing Israelis? Is it the issue of secularism versus religious orthodoxy? Is it the judiciary? Where are the dividing lines on these issues?
Yeah, well, I would say that Israel, is divided on religion and state issues, even though the majority is not religious or Orthodox. As probably many of you know, that Israel was, when it was founded, it kind of handed over a lot of the civil issues like marriage and burial to the ultra-Orthodox, and Israel has continued to do so, even though there's been a move towards secularizing some of that. But Israel is divided when it comes to how much to let the Jewishness come in. Now, if you look at on the ground and in the legal system, you have, for example, the Jewish nation state law. You have policies that have always prioritized Jews. That's kind of a separate issue. But on that level, Israelis agree that they want Israel to prioritize Jewish rights over other rights.
So that's not an issue that separates Israelis.
That's not really an issue that separates, but within that rubric, within that understanding that most Israelis want to have a Jewish ethno-nationalist state, there are many liberal Zionists who want to have separation of authorities and all the things that we know about working democracy. Obviously, Tel Aviv is like one of the gay capitals of the world. There's many LGBTQ activists on the ground, and there's a lot of freedoms within that system for Jews, of course, specifically. But the things that matter to Israelis, like anybody else, is the economy and issues like that, which on that Israelis are mostly liberal and neoliberal. I mean, there's a very, very tiny, small portion that is, properly left wing in the socialist sense. So they're not really, polarized on that. Although, again, Israel has seen a process since the 80s of privatization. And there's definitely some pushback on that from within the center left. But the judiciary that you brought up is another issue. I mean, the right that the far right that is now entering the Knesset has not just the far right, also the Likud, especially because of Netanyahu's corruption trial. They've talked about overhauling the system, and similar to into the states where they want to have more political control over the justices on the Supreme Court. So there is this issue, which I would say that the majority of Israelis don't want to see that happen. I would wager it's kind of a small hardcore right that is seeking to do that.
And it looks like they're on the verge of succeeding.
Again, it's hard to say, but they're definitely talking a big talk, and they do have a lot of power now to do that. I think there are still some legal hurdles that would make it hard for them. I don't think that tomorrow they're going to, do away with Netanyahu's trial. And it's also yet to be seen how the public would respond to such a move. But it's definitely something that they're threatening to do, and it's very possible that they could do that. And that's something that would be quite new for Israelis.
So if I understood you correctly, you're basically saying that Israel was established as a secular Jewish state that gave certain privileges to the religious Jewish establishment, if I can put it that way, in terms of personal status laws and so on. But that what we're seeing now is an increasing effort by some of these parties you've been discussing to seek to make the state itself more religious. If I understood you correctly, where do you see that dynamic evolving under the next government?
Yeah, well, I do think that it's a like you said it correctly. There's a weird balance of secularism, but also like a small theocratic kind of trend that continues throughout Israeli history. I think Bezalel Smotrich, who heads the other religious Zionist party in this list, he would like to see, as well as some of the ultra-Orthodox parties, they would like to make sure that there is no public transportation on the Sabbath. They want to keep aspects of kosher food, very strict, and they don't want to see Israel move in the direction of secularizing these institutions. The same thing that has to do with marriage or with granting, gay couples the right to have children. I forgot the word.
Adoption, I think.
Yeah, but surrogate parents.
Yes.
Anyway, so these are issues that are very much alive in the debate in Israel between religion and state, and those are things that, again, they aren't that new. They're constantly kind of being hashed out. For example, one of the most major issues is the ultra-Orthodox entering more and more into the economy and the workplace because they study and they get all these budget allocations, and they don't really do that. Also, their educational institutions don't teach sometimes the core curriculum of math and sciences. And so somebody like Avigdor Lieberman, who's very much on the right when it comes to Palestinians, thinks that they should all be going to the army and they should all be studying in the same way. So there's a lot of different moving parts to these kind of issues. And I believe that this government will try to, change some of those policies. I don't know how much it will succeed to do it as dramatically as they talk about, but it's definitely something that is a consistent current that now has a lot more public support for it. There's also the issue of Jerusalem, the holy sites, the Temple Mount, which we haven't gotten to at all, but there's been a very serious deterioration of the status quo on the Temple Mount. Very ultra-Orthodox Jews don't believe that Jews should go up there at all. But the political ones who like Itamar Ben-Gvir who want to use that are consistently going up there. They're starting to change, how Jews act when they're up there, whispering prayers, things that, under many Netanyahu governments were never really allowed. It was just kind of something that started to happen slowly, and now we have a new reality. So again, that's like a mixture of not only the religiousization of holy areas in Israel, but also the politicizing of those religious places.
And it seems like you have the nationalists, the religious forces, and then a very rapidly ascending group, which is the religious nationalists.
Yes, and again, like there's secular right-wing Israelis who will share some of those policies and some of those ideas, and there's so it's a mixture. But yes, the religious ultra-nationalist Zionist stream has now gotten much more consensus in the government.
Before turning to the occupied territories and the issues of Jerusalem you were just mentioning, I'd like to focus also on Palestinian citizens of Israel. Some commentators have suggested that with the Israeli Jewish electorate increasingly polarized and fragmented, as you've been discussing, Palestinian citizens of Israel are, through either their participation or non-participation in Israeli elections, exercising an increasingly decisive influence on the outcome of these elections. Is this an assessment you would agree with?
Yes, we've seen that. First of all, they came out in quite high numbers this time around.
Which was not expected, if I'm not mistaken.
Which was not expected at all. I think it was 54% compared with 44, 46 last time. And the expectation was that because they haven't seen any political gains since the United Arab List entered the coalition for the first time in the last government, that they wouldn't come out, but they did. And they did, even though the four Arab parties are no longer part of a joint list, which is what got them so much success back in 2015. So yes, Palestinian citizens of Israel are going through a very interesting process, I think, where they are seeking to be a much bigger part of Israeli society, both politically and economically. At the same time, for I think very obvious reasons, they're also trying to assert their Palestinian national identity within that difficult and fragile kind of identity system here. So they're trying to be more part of it, but they're also trying to assert their own role in it. And so that goes in different directions. And I think what we saw in this election was actually that they came out in quite high numbers and they maintained their 10 mandates in the Knesset. So you have the Hadash Ta'al group and you have the United Arab List, or Ra'am, headed by Mansour Abbas. They both—
Sorry, just to clarify, United Arab List is the Arab party within Israel that participated in government, and Hadash is a coalition led by the Communist Party that refused to participate and actually wasn't invited to participate.
What do you mean wasn't invited to participate?
That
in the coalition.
Yes, and then there's also a third element, which is the Balad party, which also split from the joint list in this particular election.
That's right. And the split really hurt them as far as how the mandates work in the voting. But Balad, for example, which is considered in Israel to be an anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, they are anti-Zionist, but to be very, very, there's a lot of animosity towards them. But they got 3% of the vote, 150,000 or so. They were just short of the threshold. And that's actually quite a good showing for them running on their own, which, is a whole subject in and of itself, but it basically shows that a lot of Palestinian citizens want to see a state for all its citizens. That's the Balad platform. They aren't a two-state group. They believe that Israel should be a state for all of its citizens, and that would deny its Jewish character, which is why Israelis are so against it.
And if we look at the United Arab List, as you mentioned, it participated in the outgoing government, but during the coalition formation after the previous elections, Mansour Abbas, the leader of the party, had also been willing to enter into a coalition led by Netanyahu. Do you expect them to once again seek to join this government, or is the chasm, let's say, between Abbas and Ben Gvir just too large for that?
I would say it's too large. I would also say that even if Abbas did want to, which I don't think he does, I don't think he's invited. I don't think he would be able to. Abbas did a very, very unprecedented act when he entered the coalition last year, and he really seems to be very committed to trying and gaining political achievements for his base. And a lot of his base are, for example, Bedouin citizens who live in the Negev, the Nakab, where they're constantly disenfranchised and are not able to build homes. And they have a lot of issues there that he's been trying to address. I think, we can expect him to continue to try to play a part of the political game. And he will do that with anybody who's willing to cooperate with him. But Netanyahu, who clearly negotiated with him at some point in earlier election cycles, has now told him that he's a supporter of terror and has completely relinquished himself of any connection to him. So I don't see Abbas entering this current coalition. I don't think he could also explain that to his voter base because of the rabid racism of the Ben Gvir types.
But if we look at the outcome of the latest elections, did the United Arab List's participation in government pay off? Or by contrast, did the other members of the joint list increase their voter share by staying outside the government?
Well, in a sense, they have sort of different agendas now, and they both seem to maintain their popularity. I think you could argue that Mansour Abbas's list even, I think, gained a seat from 4 to 5. So clearly, even though I think people are quite frustrated with the fact that, Palestinian citizens of Israel are not really able to play a proper part of the political game, they're not able to get the gains that they want. I think they're still interested in trying. And the same goes for the rest of the Arab parties, Balad and Hadash and Ta'al, which is run by Ahmad Tibi. They all have their own platforms that I think their voter base continues to support as well. They would have had a much better showing if they had run together. But obviously, like any other, community, they have very different views on certain issues.
Right. So turning now more broadly to the subject of let's call it Israeli-Palestinian relations, in contrast to elections in previous decades, the occupation and the broader issues that it involves once again appear not to have played a significant role in this latest election campaign. But it was, in a sense, the elephant in the room. And do you expect these latest elections to have any impact in this regard? I mean, some people have pointed out, that more Palestinians have been killed in the past year than I believe in any of the previous 18 or so years. And that substantively, there has been very little to distinguish the past few Israeli governments. So do you expect that the return of Netanyahu to the prime ministry will have any impact in terms of that question?
In terms of the status of the occupation specifically?
Or more in terms of generally how Israel is dealing with the Palestinians.
Right.
Does the appointment of a new Israeli government have an impact on those relationships?
I mean, it certainly has an impact. I think the impact is that we will continue to see the same patterns that we've seen both under Netanyahu governments and even under the Lapid-Bennett government. As you said, this year under not Netanyahu, there's been, increasing raids in the West Bank. There's been a lot of, very trigger-happy shooting of Palestinians. Anybody who throws a stone is liable to be shot and killed. So I think we're going to continue to see that. The occupation of Palestine is something that, has only become less and less of an issue in the Israeli electorate. At the same time, if I had to really try to analyze going forward with this far-right government, it's possible that some aspects of that issue could come up. The terror attacks that we've seen recently that have led, to the current tensions is something that I think most Israelis think we need to be tougher. We need to be tougher. But if we have a far-right government with no restraints, even less restraints than what we've seen, that could at some point backfire, because I think ultimately, Israel can't guarantee security for its citizens while it continues to settle its civilian population in occupied territory, and while it continues to put Israelis in the center of Palestinian neighborhoods. I don't think it should expect to be able to secure its citizens in that way. So, I mean, obviously this is a long game. It's not something that's going to happen anytime soon. But, it's going to get a lot worse. And so that's going to have to, make those in power either become a lot tougher. I don't know what that means right now. That could mean shooting even more Palestinians a day. That could mean offering to completely strip them of even the little bit of rights that they still have. And that, could push a process in which there would be some kind of either international pushback or hopefully on some level that the Israeli left will rebuild itself into something new that approaches these issues differently. I mean, we've had the same kind of two-state solution rhetoric. I mean, even Lapid still talks about supporting two states, but he clearly doesn't support the two states that were talked about 20 years ago under the 1967 borders. So I think that, the more that Israel goes to the right, especially with this kind of coalition, the more it will speed up processes that will have to reach some kind of head. And that head, I'm talking again, longer process. That head could either go really, really ugly, or some leader will come and say, enough is enough. We have to kind of figure this out.
Well, another trend that we've seen in the past year also is a dramatic rise in settler violence in the West Bank. And given the anticipated composition of Israel's next government, would you expect this to expand even further?
I mean, yes, I do expect it to expand, but it's important to understand that settler violence has been a phenomenon that has continued to surge, for years, and no government has really done anything about it. Just a few days or weeks ago, there was, a couple of incidents of settler violence. Nobody's been arrested, even when it's settler violence against Israeli activists, not just Palestinians. Even against the army, there isn't really that much done. So I expect that to continue. I do think that settlers in general are going to be much more emboldened than they have been, even though they've already been quite emboldened by, they can act with impunity under all of these governments. This government even more so. The fear, I think, is not only that this will continue, but that it will get much, much worse. And I would say even more scarier than settler violence is the military violence that will continue to become more and more aggressive and unrestrained.
And maybe these two aspects aren't separate. I mean, there have been numerous instances of the settlers basically being, protected, assisted by the military, and the settlers in some respects are functioning as an auxiliary to the military, despite the tensions we sometimes see between them. And but finally, I'd like to pick up on a point you raised about a potential international pushback. And what we've seen over the course of the past several decades is that each successive Israeli government seems to have a more right-wing character than its predecessor. It includes the mainstreaming of figures and parties who, as you noted, were previously on the fringe, yet they become normalized by the international community, and particularly by the United States and the European Union. If the next Israeli government does indeed include a figure like Ben-Gvir in a senior role, let's say much like Lieberman was a senior minister in a previous Netanyahu government, do you expect Washington and Brussels, as they have before, to just pretend nothing dramatic happened, or would you anticipate that this time there may be consequences?
Unfortunately, I don't see there being consequences, both because the US under Biden specifically isn't, I mean, even under a Democratic administration, isn't interested in the Middle East as much. It's put all of its political capital elsewhere in Iran and now elsewhere completely. So it's not going to do anything about it on that level. It's going to continue to use rhetoric that condemns these issues. I mean, the US State Department has already put out some kind of statement about how they might not engage with some of these Knesset members. I don't know what in practice that would mean. But I don't expect the international community to do much. I do wonder what would be the red line that Israel could reach by which they would finally do something. But neither Europe nor the US seem to be, all the processes that we've talked about, they've done nothing to stop. And I think part of the reason,
business as usual, in
it's
effect.
business as usual. And it looks really bad for Israel right now, this new government. It looks bad, but that doesn't mean that the international community is interested in doing anything more than it's already showed that it's not interested in doing. And I think also that part of the reason Netanyahu felt the freedom and the legitimacy to lean on this far right, and to himself and within his own party go so far right. And also the Trump years, he basically put annexation completely on the table. All these things are a direct result of the fact that the international community has done nothing to stop Israel's expansionist and military rule. I mean, this we're seeing a product of completely relinquishing responsibility for this issue.
So in many respects, what we're seeing today is the logical outcome of processes and dynamics that have been in place already for many decades.
Years. Yes, both within Israel and outside of it, for sure.
Mairav Zonszein, thank you very much for sharing your insights and expertise with Connections. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks a lot, Mouin. It was a pleasure.